To talk about South Korea is to think of that flood of neon lights illuminating Seoul, K-pop idols parading around in impeccable costumes, addictive dramas on Netflix, and a people who seem to live in a technological future. Sounds like a paradise of happiness, right? But real life is very different from what you see in the colorful MVs of BTS or the sugary romances of K-dramas. Did you know that, contrary to its economic success and technological power, South Korea is one of the countries with the highest rates of unhappiness in the world? That's right, and I'm not making this up. Just look at mental health reports, suicide rates, and the testimonies of young people who live in isolation out of fear and social pressure. Today, Bello Mundo is going to take you on a slightly uncomfortable but extremely necessary journey to understand why South Korea carries the heavy title of the saddest country in the world. Let's talk about the side that beauty advertisements and boy band performances don't show. South Korea is impressive. The economic miracle has made the country soar on the global stage. GDP has exploded. Brands like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG have become giants, and pop culture has turned the country into a worldwide phenomenon. K-pop, dramas, award-winning films. The whole world looks at Korea and sees a modern, technological place, full of stylish cafes and young people parading through the vibrant streets. Sounds like the perfect setting, right? But behind this facade, the reality is quite different. In practice, South Korea is one of the saddest countries in the world. A survey by the Korean government itself revealed that in 2023, 74% of respondents faced mental health problems, including chronic stress, anxiety, and even self-destructive thoughts. And here we're not just talking about people who felt sad or overwhelmed. We're talking about people who have considered taking their own lives. One of the most shocking cases was young teacher Lee Min-so, just 23 years old. In her diary, she described the panic she felt when she entered the classroom. "My chest feels so tight, it feels like I'm going to fall somewhere. I don't even know where I am." A few days later, she wrote, "I want to drop everything." Shortly afterwards, she was found lifeless in her classroom cupboard. And what's worse, she wasn't the only one. In Korea, social pressure is an emotional time bomb, a system that demands too much, welcomes too little, and teaches that making mistakes is unforgivable. But where does all this pressure come from? What leads these people down such sad paths? That's exactly what we're going to explore now. Number 1. The famous demand for success and bullying in schools. If there's one thing that already puts South Korea on the road to unhappiness, it's the education system. Korean schools are known for being extremely competitive. Students spend all day studying. And when I say all day, I don't mean all day. The routine starts early in the morning, continues with extra classes at the famous private courses, and only ends late at night with piles of assignments and more studying at home. All this because, in order to get a good job in the future, it's practically mandatory to get into an elite university. And failing at this stage is not an option. Excelling in your studies isn't just an individual matter, it's a huge social and family responsibility. Get a grade below average? Shame on you. Don't pass the entrance exam at the most prestigious university? Failure. Mistakes are not seen as part of learning, but as something humiliating, and the pressure is so great that many students simply can't take it. And as if that weren't enough, there's also bullying. The school environment in Korea isn't just academic, it's also a social battleground. Anyone who doesn't fit the pattern, be it appearance, personality, or performance, becomes a target. Some famous dramas, such as The Glory, have already portrayed abuse in schools in an impactful way. And believe me, the reality can be even worse. The sum of absurd expectations of success and a hostile school environment creates a spiral of depression and anxiety from adolescence onwards. Many young people develop anxiety disorders, panic attacks, and fear of disappointing their parents. There are people who hardly sleep, who spend the day pumped up on energy drinks, coffee, and medication just to keep studying. Now think, if you can't cope with the pressure of grades, being ridiculed or excluded by your peers, and even coming home to be scolded for getting 9.5 instead of 10, what chance do you have of keeping your mental health intact? What's worse, this pressure doesn't stop at school. When the student finally enters college, the war continues. The cycle of pressure never ends. Internships, extracurricular courses, fluent English, volunteering, and, on top of all that, having to look perfect. Number 2. The price of perfection. It's impossible to talk about mental suffering in South Korea without mentioning the obsession with beauty. You've certainly seen K-pop idols with flawless skin, slim bodies, and symmetrical faces, almost as if they'd stepped out of a real-life beautification filter. But this perfect aesthetic doesn't just stay on stage. It spreads throughout society, turning the pressure for beauty into a real, everyday nightmare. South Korea is a world leader in the cosmetics industry. Skincare, makeup, aesthetic treatments, all sold as a must for anyone who wants to be socially accepted. But it goes far beyond creams and serums. Plastic surgery is so common that in many cases, parents themselves pay for it for their children as a 16th birthday present. The idea is simple. If you're not naturally beautiful, you need to fix it. And don't think that this obsession is limited to the mirror. In Korea, even job resumes require a photo. And in many companies, appearance can be a decisive factor in whether or not you are hired. The standards imposed are cruel: fair skin, a slender body, delicate features. Those who don't meet these standards can be bullied, excluded, or even struggle to find a job. And the result of this constant pressure: eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and a feeling that you're never good enough. Some women and even men have created movements such as Escape the Corset, an attempt to free themselves from this aesthetic imprisonment. But in practice, those who don't follow the rules still feel the weight of social exclusion. The pursuit of an unattainable standard not only drains financially, but also destroys the mental health of thousands of Koreans. After all, how can you be happy in a place where looking perfect is worth more than simply being yourself? Number 3. The stress of working hours. You think it's over? Unfortunately not. Let's say you've survived school and university, gone through the hell of academic pressure, faced the burden of looking perfect, and are now finally entering the job market. The problem? They're going to fall into a system that doesn't let up. The corporate environment in South Korea is known for its grueling working hours. For many people, working 10, 12, or even more hours a day is not an exaggeration. It's the norm. But the official hours aren't always the worst. There is an informal period where socializing with bosses and colleagues becomes almost an obligation. And socializing, in this case, means going out drinking, going out to dinner to discuss goals, and following unwritten orders from the hierarchy. Anyone who refuses to participate or simply says, "I'd rather go home and rest," can be seen as lazy, disinterested, or even disloyal to the team. The result? An endless cycle of exhaustion. There are few or no breaks for leisure and family, insane pressure for results, and of course, an absurd level of stress. It's not uncommon to see people fainting on the subway, taking naps on street benches, or needing medication just to sleep for a few hours. And when you add this insane routine to the "I can never fail" culture, you have the perfect recipe for burnout syndrome. In fact, it's no coincidence that more and more young Koreans are reporting emotional exhaustion, anxiety attacks, and suicidal thoughts. Recent studies show an explosion of burnout cases in the country, especially among office workers. Working hard is one thing. Being swallowed up by work with no right to rest is quite another. Number 4. Social isolation. Some people, faced with this whirlwind of demands, simply give up interacting with the outside world. They lock themselves away at home for months or even years, with no contact with anyone, living on delivery and the internet, isolated in their rooms. This phenomenon is reminiscent of hikikomori, a Japanese term used to describe people who choose to live in complete seclusion, running away from society. And in South Korea, the number of young people in this situation is growing all the time. It is estimated that around 340,000 Koreans between the ages of 19 and 39 are living in this state of severe seclusion. Many end up developing depression, anxiety, and other serious mental disorders, but don't even seek help, either for fear of judgment or because they simply don't have the energy. The government has even tried to launch financial and psychological support programs, encouraging these people to return to society, but most remain cloistered. This social isolation is also fueled by the fear of failure, of not meeting expectations, or of being humiliated. Everything we've already seen in the previous topics. In other words, the person says, "You know what? I'd rather stay in my room than face the world charging me 24 hours a day." In the end, South Korea has created a society where being good is not enough. You have to be the best. And faced with this, many people simply give up trying. Number 5. Machismo and domestic violence. Historically, and especially in Asian cultures, women have been raised to be submissive. And even though the world is advancing in so many areas, this submissiveness is still visible in many ways. An example? Just look at Chinese women. To this day, they suffer from stigma and prejudice if they don't follow certain norms set by society. Did you know, for example, that in China, parents still advertise children, especially unmarried daughters, in marketplaces as if they were in a marriage market? In addition, there are courses that teach women how to behave at weddings. But of all the questionable teachings, perhaps the most absurd is, if he hits you, don't hit back. Hold on and don't ask for a divorce. But back to South Korean women. The situation in South Korea is not very different. Like Chinese women, many Korean women face a society that is still prejudiced and often extremely sexist. However, things are starting to change, and more women are giving up looking for local partners. There is even a movement that has sprung up there called 4B, which means, in free translation, the 4 don'ts. Don't date, don't have intimate relations, don't get married, and don't have children. While in TV dramas, Korean men may seem like perfect princes, cute, romantic, and attentive. The reality, according to many Korean women, is quite different. A recent survey shows that around 65% of women in the country don't want to get married or have children. The high rate of domestic violence in the country means that, for many, marriage is just a gateway to even bigger problems, and structural machismo is present everywhere. To give you an idea of the level of machismo, a Seoul politician even blamed women for the increase in tragedies involving men in the country. He claimed that, by entering the job market, women are stealing men's jobs, which, according to him, is driving Korean women away from marriage and consequently leading men to take their lives. This is exactly why women are moving away. The result is low interest in marriage, an almost non-existent birth rate, and a generation increasingly disillusioned with the idea of forming a family. Number 6. Mental health. As if all these triggers weren't enough, there's another huge problem: the taboo surrounding mental health. In the West, talking about depression, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion has become more common in recent years. Therapy, medication, and psychological support have come to be seen as legitimate forms of care. But in South Korea, the mentality is completely different. There is still a very strong stigma there, especially among the older generations, who see psychological problems as coolness or weakness. And this has serious consequences. Many people don't receive a diagnosis, don't seek treatment, and end up seeing their condition worsen. In schools and universities, there are even counseling programs, but they are often seen as something of a failure. What about going to a psychiatrist? It could mean being seen as unstable or problematic, which could even jeopardize future employment. In other words, it's a tricky situation. The person needs help, but if they ask for it, they could suffer even more prejudice. And how do you deal with this absurd pressure? Well, as you've seen, some young Koreans simply give up on participating in this system and hide from everyone and everything. There are also those who move to rural areas in search of peace and quiet, those who abandon beauty standards, and those who try to rebuild their lives abroad. But for most, this is not a viable option. With no way out, many turn to alcohol. South Korea is one of the countries that consumes the most alcohol in the world, and we're not talking about casual drinking with friends. What happens there is that they drink until they pass out in the street. It's common to see whole groups of co-workers or friends downing glass after glass, sometimes to the point of falling ill. In practice, alcohol becomes an anesthetic for an unbearable routine. Number 7. The escalation of suicides. And then we come to the worst number of all. With so many problems, so many demands, and so little perspective, it's no wonder that South Korea leads the ranking of suicides among OECD countries. And it's not just adults and the elderly who take their own lives. Among the 10 to 30 age group, suicide is the leading cause of death. Think about it. Young people who should be in the prime of life, studying, dating, having fun, are precisely those who give up on life the most. According to government data, the national rate is around 24 to 26 suicides per 100,000 inhabitants, one of the highest in the developed world. And it's not a recent problem. Year after year, these figures continue to be alarming. And don't think that it only affects anonymous people. Even K-pop stars, world famous, loved by millions of fans, end up not being able to take the pressure. Cases like that of Chinese Kim Jong-hyun, who left a letter saying that depression had devoured him, or singers Sulli and Guhara, who shocked fans all over the world, show that even those with money and fame can't escape this reality. Now imagine the average person who works 14 hours a day, lives under an absurd weight of demands, and has no one to talk to. It's a cruel cycle. The pressure comes, the person suffers, doesn't seek help for fear of stigma. Depression worsens, and in many cases, the worst happens. Number 8. The loneliness of the elderly. And as if all that wasn't enough, even the elderly experience extreme loneliness in South Korea. The country has one of the highest rates of elderly people taking their own lives in the world. And the reason? Abandonment and lack of financial support. With a low birth rate and a culture of hard work, many children simply don't have the time or interest to look after their parents. Without an efficient welfare system, many elderly people live in poverty, surviving on precarious jobs or minimal government assistance. There is a phenomenon in the country called kodokushi, which means lonely death. Basically, many elderly people die alone in their apartments without anyone noticing for days or even weeks. It's a shocking and sad scene, but extremely common. After going through all this, the stifling education system, the impossible beauty standards, the exhausting work culture, the social isolation, and the lack of psychological support, you can understand why South Korea carries the title of one of the saddest countries in the world. Of course, the country remains a fascinating place, full of innovation, rich culture, and incredible experiences. But when you look beyond the perfect facade, it's clear that not all this modernity has been able to bring happiness to its people. So, did you already know this other side of South Korea? Which of these realities surprised you the most? If you like content that goes beyond the obvious and reveals stories that nobody tells, stay with us. There's a lot more to discover about our Bello Mundo. Thank you very much for following us here, and we'll see you in the next video.